Alright, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Baron, and you may be noticing that I am flying the Soviet Yak-9T. Now, a spoiler real quick is that during this gameplay I did not die. So it is what I call becoming a fighter ace, where you get more than 5 kills and don't die and survive for the rest of the game. Now, since I've already done this already, you may have already noticed I already put up a Yak-9T ace video, and that was kind of my impressions as it was happening. It was a live action video, whereas this one is an after action report. So basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to give basically an overview on the Yak-9T and kind of what I think of it. And basically it'll go like this. I'm going to compare the Yak-9 to some of the other aircraft in the game, ones that are kind of similar in armament, and then also against aircraft that historically the Yak-9 was built to compete against. Next I'm going to give kind of the historical background on the Yak-9T. There's some pretty interesting things about it. Then I'm going to go over what we can expect to see in War Thunder in the future, as currently this is only in beta, and as we should all be well aware of, that Gaijin is going to release even more aircraft in the future. And then finally I'm going to give you my overall opinion on the Yak-9. Now, given that this is my second ace video on the Yak-9, you can probably have a good idea on what my opinion is going to be at the end of this video. But anyway, let's get started. So first, we're going to talk about comparing this Yak to some other aircraft. Now, my first comparison in my head was, well, you know, the Americans have their Air Cobras and their King Cobras, both having 37mm cannons. So I thought, and they kind of seem rather similar. So let's look at them, for example. Now the Yak-9, I'm going to compare the Yak-9T to the P-39, I think it's the Q, and then I'm going to compare it to basically the level 9 through 11 P-63s. Now, at first glance, the P-39s are level 6, the Yak-9Ts are level 9, or the singular Yak-9T is level 9, and then the P-63s are anywhere between 9 and 11. And the Yak-9T is superior to both the P-39s and the P-63s in terms of turn time and firepower. And firepower in this game is effectively measured by your burst mass and how many kilograms of munition you're able to put out in a second, and that is averaged out. Now the Yak-9T has a burst mass of 3.99 kilograms a second, compared to the P-39Qs, which I believe it's a 3.62, and then the P-63, it's anywhere between 3.62 and 3.81, so it has a little bit better firepower. And I noticed the first time I played this was that the higher burst mass comes in because the Soviet 37mm cannon fires much faster. Not much faster, but noticeably faster than the American 37mm cannons. Now, in turn time, the Yak-9 has an 18.5 second turn time, at least on the stat sheets. Now this is beta and everything's kind of, they're still working out a lot of the flight models, but the P-39, for example, has a 20.9 turn time. And then the P-63s have a 22.4 turn time. So the Yak-9 obviously has a much better turn time. And then if you look at the climbing speed, the P-39, the level 6 American Air Cobras have better climbing than the P-63s or the Yak-9Ts. The Yak-9T has 16 meters per second climbing, and the P-39 has 17, and the P-63 only has a 13 meter per second climbing speed. And then the Yak-9T max speed is like 598 kilometers per hour. The P39 is kind of slow with a 525 kilometers per hour, and then the P63s, which you could basically consider them really effective bomber interceptors, given their high armament and fast speed, and they have 657 kilometers per hour top speed. Now, a lot of this, top speed, it isn't really used so much because you have to deal with altitude and diving or rising and stuff like that. But basically, the Yak-9 is more maneuverable and has a greater hitting power than both the Air Cobras and the King Cobras. So that was my first comparison to basically compare the Yak-9 against was the Air Cobras and King Cobras because of the 37mm cannon. And in World War II, the Yak-9, now this is just the Yak-9 plain variant, not the Yak-9T. And the Yak-9T was the variant with the 37mm cannon, but the Yak-9 was very, very successful and feared, rightfully so, in World War II. The Luftwaffe, German Luftwaffe, at one point basically warned its pilots to stay away from the Yak-9 because of how potent it was at downing Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s, which were the premier and most widely, the German aircraft all of us think of when we think of World War II. And the Bf-109s were better at higher altitudes, so the Yak-9s mostly operated at lower altitude where they could easily outclass the Bf-109s and even the Focke-Wulf 190s. Now, I mean, when you're watching this gameplay, you can see why Gaijin, the first Yak-9 we got to see, was the 37mm cannon version. And because the thing has just some serious takedown power. In World War II, they said about the Yak-9T, all you really needed was one 37mm cannon shot, and you'd blow the other aircraft to shreds. Now, in arcade mode, obviously, you have to deal with some balancing issues because this is a video game after all. And, probably in historical battles and definitely in full real battles, it'll probably only take one 37mm cannon shot on most aircraft to blow them to smithereens. But in arcade mode, there are balancing issues, so it may take a couple for different aircraft or depending on where you hit them, and that's just kind of to increase the playability, because if not, then everyone would be flying these. And you already noticed that most people's favorite level 9 and below Russian aircraft fighter is the Yak-9T because of its power, and you see so many Air Cobras and King Cobras. Like, looking right there, you already see two Cobras because people are loving those 37mm cannons. Now let's kind of talk about the history of the Yak-9, and this includes the 9T. But the Yak-9 was developed off an improved version of the Yak-7, the Yakovlev 7, which had proven very successful and very capable in World War II in competing against the Germans. Because in the early days of World War II, the Russian Air Force was just so outclassed by the Germans, it was ridiculous. That's where a lot of the I-16s were used. And there was even a lot of people talk about, in the defense of ramming, well, historically, the Russians rammed and the Japanese rammed. Well, the Japanese, it was more of a kamikaze thing. That was them running into ships because their aircraft were so they were being outcompeted by the newer, better designed American aircraft. But finally, once the Russians were able to, catch back up, they developed the Yak-7, a bunch of other aircraft, and then finally they came across the Yak-9. And it was very successful. It was first used in combat in the Battle of Stalingrad. And so that was in late 1942. And as said before, it was primarily suited for lower altitude fighting, where it would outclass the German equivalents. And its main use, the Yak-9T, which is different than the Yak-9, and because the Yak-9 had the standard version was one 12.7mm machine gun and one 20mm Schwach cannon. I just love that name, Schwach. It's like, holy Schwach! The Russians are behind me! That's probably where they got the name from. That's what I like to think anyway. But the Yak-9T with its 37mm cannon was used against tanks, because think about that. That thing will get through a tank's armor. Especially if you attack, the weaker top side of the turret or the rear of the tanks. And it was obviously used against aircraft, but it was, I think, the most interesting use that I heard and researched about with the Yak-9T was its use against shipping, primarily in the Black Sea. Now, the Black Sea campaign is probably one of those lesser commonly known campaigns in World War II. And those are generally the campaigns that I really like reading about, because it's stuff you don't see movies on, you don't see television shows, miniseries on, and you don't really read too much or hear about because, over here in America, like, when I was young, like, you didn't really realize that the biggest battles in World War II were between the Germans and the Russians. We always heard of D-Day and Pearl Harbor and all of that stuff as a young boy. Like, you think that's all World War II was really about. But as I get older and more curious and just reading about all the epic things, and then the lesser known theaters, like the Black Sea and the Baltic for the Russians specifically, like, you learn, oh, Russia actually had a pretty sizable navy. So the Black Sea was basically where modern-day Ukraine and Russia, the sea borders Turkey, which was neutral in World War II, and then Romania. So basically, the Russians had their Black Sea fleet, which consisted of a battleship, 5 or so cruisers, 18 or so destroyers, and then a bunch of submarines and mine layers and torpedo boats. And this was a pretty sizable fleet. But the big kicker was that Turkey was neutral in the war, and they controlled this series of 2 straits, which are known as the Dardanelles, which separated the Black Sea from the Mediterranean. So imagine if the Russians were able to get this fleet out into the Mediterranean and harass the Italians and Germans. So basically, the Axis powers relied on the Romanian fleet and then some contributions by the Germans and the Italians to basically kind of keep the Russians from maybe forcing their way through the strait, either politically or militarily. And, well, you may ask, well, how did the Germans and the Italians get their fleets or their ships, where the Germans provided U-boats, Schnell boats, and R-boats, and the Italians put a couple torpedo boats and a couple midget submarines into the Black Sea to basically harass this big Russian fleet that was there. And since they couldn't go through the Turkish straits to get there because Turkey was neutral and they didn't allow either side to get through, they sent them via rail and canals, which was really just kind of cool. Like, I like how when you really need to do something, how creative you can get. So that's why a lot of the ships were very small. There wasn't any really sizable shipping on the Axis powers aside from a few Romanian destroyers. So anyway, the big thing that happened though with this Russian fleet was that the Germans attacked by land and took the Crimean Peninsula, where the big naval port of Sevastopol was, that the Russians held. And there was one other, key naval base in the area. But, so this Russian fleet had to flee over to where modern-day Georgia is. And Georgia did not have any decent ports or, ship repairing or, outfitting capabilities. So it really decrease the effectiveness of this Russian fleet. So this is where the Yak-9T comes in. This Yak-9T is armed with a 37mm cannon, and since the Russians can't really send out their battleships and their cruisers and their destroyers for fear if they get damaged they'll have no ability to repair them, and they're too valuable to really be torn apart by smaller naval ships on the Axis side, that the Russians sent in the Yak-9T. And you look at the German S-boats and R-boats, which their biggest armament, aside from torpedoes in the S-boats case, look at this little cluster right there, was that the S-boats and R-boats had, boom, a 37mm cannon. So their biggest armament is the same thing that this aircraft is armed with. So you can imagine if these ships have 37mm cannons, then obviously an airplane with one will definitely be able to do some work on some shipping. So I found that pretty interesting. And if you want to know more about why most people didn't really want to mess with Turkey and go through those straits and just say, hey, we're going through, look up the Gallipoli campaign from World War I. And that just shows you if Turkey doesn't want you going through, you're not going through. So now this brings us to, now that we got our historical nerdiness out of the way, now we're going to go to what we can expect from Gaijin in War Thunder with regards to the Yak-9. Well, the Yak-9T was not the main model for production. There was numerous models of production, and it was a very successful model of aircraft in World War II in performance and KD ratio and all of that. And if you look at the release tree, Gaijin is going to release 7 different variants of the Yak-9, and then 3 different variants of the Yak-9Y and P. So at first I was like, why is there only a Yak-9T? Why isn't there a Yak-9? And then I looked at the release tree and realized, oh, Gaijin, being a Russian company and being aware of the power of this aircraft, is going to release a lot more. So I'm very excited to see that. So now let's kind of get into my opinion on this aircraft. It is highly maneuverable as it was historically. It has some real hitting power with that 37mm cannon. And I think the only thing I have noticed that is a downside to this, but not for me in gameplay, but just, I guess, in balances. I mean, if you look at this, and if you look at my other Ace video, I've taken a beating and I've kept flying, whereas other aircraft would have probably been taken down already. So the survivability may be a little unfair currently, but I'm sure they'll fix that. I mean, look at that black wing, pink fuselage. Like, there's not much downside. Like, I haven't noticed much degrading in my flight performance. Now, so I got 7 kills, and I only got 37,000 experience, which was a little disappointing, and that was on my daily double. So my overall opinion of this aircraft, maneuverable, great hitting power. This is one of my favorite Russian fighters, and rightfully so. It was very successful in World War II. So I'm glad that they have this in the game. I'm Baron, thanks for watching. So yeah, I'm gonna die. It's gonna happen. But we're gonna drop in. We got, what, 4 bombs and 8 rockets, and then we got some just beastliness. Boom, son! Oh, look at that tail gunner. Get him off my tail! Got things to do. Oh, look at that carpet bombing action. Nope. I don't want to die yet. Sorry. Call me selfish, but get off my junk!